My book is not about condemning black culture. I think you can read it carefully and see. I withdraw from that. I don't hate the baggy pants kid. I don't scorn the welfare mother. You can read it carefully and see. You can read it carefully and see. I withdraw from that. I don't hate the baggy pants kid. I don't scorn the welfare mother. I don't hate the baggy pants kid. I don't scorn the welfare mother.
Joining me is John McWhorter, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. And he says all these reasons and others that are commonly accepted are wrong. Dr. McWhorter is a PhD in linguistics from Stanford, the author of 10 books, including the best-selling and influential Losing the Race. He has written scores of op-eds and think pieces on race and culture and is a fixture on television news and radio commentary. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Duff.
Your latest book, Winning the Race, is really a follow-up, it seems, to Losing the Race, and it's provoked a great deal of attention and reaction, as has the earlier book. You're all over. You're in the media. You're on your book tour geographically.
God help me, yeah.
Why has the book stimulated such diverse reaction, warmly embraced by some and sharply attacked by others?
Because there's an idea, especially among what you might call thinking people, that the truth about race is that there are societal factors larger than any one person, and that these are the things that explain the problems that we see in the black community, and that to say that there's anything going on with individuals themselves is unkind, that it's uninformed, that there's no way that you can say that there's a problem with black culture and be a concerned person. Winning the Race tells what I think is the truth. And what I think most people know deep down is the truth, which is that society's not perfect, far from it, but that a culture can have problems. We know that plenty of other cultures have problems throughout the world, but we're reluctant to say that black American culture has a problem because black people used to be slaves, and then there was Jim Crow, and there's still racism today. All three of those things are true. None of them mean that black culture can't have some problems that it's generating itself. The culture is generating the problems because of racism in the past, but today, to get rid of them, society is no longer what we can address.
Okay, and you talk about racism, quote, and it's an occasional nuisance that need not impede the black success that we wish.
That is true, and that's considered a controversial statement by many people. But that sentence you just read is true, and I spend a lot of the book trying to argue why.
Do that. Talk about the central thesis of the book, or central theses of the book, and then the evidence for the theses and sort of your disparate comments on a variety of social issues and phenomena. What's the thesis?
All that in a couple of
yes.
sentences.
Well, in 26 and a half minutes, we can do a lot.
Right. The thesis is that, yes, there's racism. It's often considered very important by people that be acknowledged. Okay, I'm saying it. There is racism. If we had more than 26 minutes, then I could give a whole list of things. For the viewer, whatever the list is in your head, I agree. There is racism. However, we're taught that because of especially residual racism or societal racism, that a group cannot achieve, or more to the point, we're told that black Americans cannot achieve. It's not true. Black is beautiful? Okay. Black people are strong? Okay. If you believe that, then we have to get rid of the idea that because the playing field isn't perfectly level, that black people can't succeed. And what I mean by that is this. It's not that black people are supposed to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. I don't mean that at all. I'm all in favor of many government programs, philanthropic programs. But what we have to get past is the idea that only that is what we really need to be talking about. And we have to get past the idea that until the playing field is completely level, we've got a tragic problem and that poor black people must remain where they are. Winning the Race is to an extent about activism and how what we're trying to do is help people to help themselves. What bothers me is that a lot of people think that helping people to help themselves means waiting until there is no kind of subtle racist bias anywhere in the system, waiting until there's a massive Marshall Plan along the lines of the Great Society again, which we know is never going to happen, even if we might like it to.
Right.
We have to get back to really helping in an on-the-ground way instead of waiting for miracles, which unfortunately aren't going to happen.
How did blacks end up in the situation they are? You say it's not racism, white racism, but it's whites. What whites, when, and how?
It's the counterculture, it's the 60s. Starting in the late 1960s, a new idea started percolating throughout black America, throughout young America, throughout left America, which was that shaking your fists at the system itself was activism, instead of going on the ground and actually helping people. And in the book I call it therapeutic alienation, which is not really a very good name for it. But what I mean by that is that often today it's thought that you've gotten your stripes, you've proven your point, you've done what you're supposed to do, for example, to go on the radio and say that there is institutional racism, and to make white people uncomfortable, or if you're white, to show that you've got all of your ducks in a row about racism. But that alone doesn't help, for example, the mother who used to be on welfare, who's now past her 5-year cap and has kids to raise, and might want to do something other than work in a slaughterhouse or something like that.
Now, is this therapeutic racism
Alienation.
alienation rather, is it endemic among the black elites, or do you see this as part of the mainstream culture of the black mass, if you will?
It depends. I mean, there's great diversity in black culture. A lot of what I aim my writing at in Winning the Race, though, is that in academia, especially among black academics and among a lot of people in black municipal bureaucracies, you have this kind of therapeutic alienation. And all it is really is thinking that black people cannot be helped until society turns upside down. Because we know that society is not going to turn upside down. And to keep arguing that when, as a person, with your faculties, you know society is not going to turn upside down again, means that you're really doing it for yourself. It becomes a series of theatrical gestures, and I think that they're kind of self-affirming. This is something that you see in white culture in various aspects of the left. This is not a black issue.
Right.
But unfortunately, I think that black culture overdoses on that kind of gesture over action. We need to go back to what civil rights activism really used to be.
Two names immediately pop up when you're talking about this: Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson. They would seem to be almost the archetypes of the purveyors and actors of this therapeutic alienation.
Sure. With Sharpton, what it comes down to simply is, why is he considered a leader? It's just what he is a performer, and he's a very good one. But the fact that he is not drummed out of the black leadership completely shows that the gesture has a primacy over action. What has he done? Or Jesse Jackson, as massive a presence as he is, imagine a black history book written in 2050. Now there's an entry for Jesse Jackson. What did he do? He ran for president. You know, he made some speeches. What did he contribute? Nothing whatsoever. And yet, he has this attention. People who contributed that little in, say, 1940, or even as late as 1960, wouldn't have gotten any attention. Those men are performers. They're good at the gesture. And then they become rock stars. That's a problem, because the people who used to be rock stars were the ones who were really changing people's lives.
Are there any emerging or existing rock stars of the old order who have a coherent activist agenda rather than simply acting out? That's the distinction between acting out and activism.
That's a good way of putting it. There will never be replacement figures for, say, Martin Luther King, because the issues now are not, in a way, as transparent and simple as getting rid of institutionalized bigotry. Now it's a matter of taking the segment of the black community who've been left behind, or who have been caught up in self-defeating behaviors, and getting them to the point that they can take care of themselves and their own children. That's a local issue. And so today's black heroes are people working within particular cities doing unglamorous work. Here in New York, it's Jeffrey Canada and the Harlem Children's Zone, for example.
Okay. You talk about this legacy that produced this therapeutic alienation. Talk a little bit about the genesis, historically, of what you see as this phenomenon.
It's based on a fear of standing on your own 2 feet, and it's something that you see in a lot of human groups. Once Black America was freed from institutionalized segregation, suddenly we had to take care of ourselves. But we had been battered by 350 years of brutality and dismissal, and so there was kind of an ego problem. There still is in Black America. One way that you can assuage that is to always point to somebody doing something to you. That's called the martyr. It's a human type. But it was easy for Black America to fall into those patterns in the late 60s, especially since this was at the exact time that there was the new phenomenon, and here I'm taking a page from Shelby Steele, of white guilt. A lot of people don't realize how little interest even the thinking white person had in black people as late as, say, 1958. 10 years later, black people are an issue, and white America is ready to listen to black grievance in a way that it had not been just
Well,
a
the
few
cities
years
are
before.
I mean, there's a lot going on.
The riots,
So
etc.
you have the civil rights movement, you have the civil disorders.
the Black Power movement,
The assassination of King.
the assassination of King, all of those things came together and set up a new pattern where Black America was assailing white America for the past and the present. And there was a kind of a thrill to that. There was a sense of release. And I think that Black Americans often then got a sense of their own legitimacy from being victims. That's something that can happen. Being the victim becomes your identity. It's kind of comfortable in a way because it absolves you of confronting that now you have to stand on your own 2 feet. We still suffer from that.
The thesis and the argument makes sense. The one thing that I was concerned with was the lack of data. Obviously, impressionistically and intuitively, you get the feel, but have there been longitudinal studies or cross-sectional studies, data looking at the black mass, either with survey research or focus groups, that could really document this phenomenon that you're talking about?
That's an interesting question, Doug. And of course, the answer is no. And I think that it would be impossible because we're talking about covert sentiments, for example. You can't ask someone, are you a victim of therapeutic alienation? Are you expressing these political views because it makes you comfortable? People aren't aware of these things.
Right, but you can
And
get
so
around it, a good survey researcher and
I
a good
honestly don't think that
Okay.
any kind of empirical research could identify it. And so there's
Oh.
a weakness in any kind of analysis such as mine, which is that numbers really can't do it. I mean, for
Okay.
one thing, it's 40 years now.
Right.
But yeah, that's a good question. One just has to try to make the data fit
Right.
one's analysis,
Right.
but there will always be that haziness.
Right. New left, welfare. You see the new left, and almost specifically one of the professors in this building, Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward, in their book, Regulating the Poor, and in their movement, as almost prime movers in this disintegration of the black community in one sense, and the rise of this feeling or this paradigm of therapeutic alienation.
Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward created so much black pain, and it's really a shame how little this is known. It's very simple. The idea that there could be a kind of welfare policy where generation after generation stayed on it, and nobody cared whether the people got a job, and you were paid for having kids, didn't exist until the late 60s. A lot of people seem, understandably, to think that that's the way welfare always was. It was that way for a good 30 years. That only started then. There's a reason why when you read a novel about the black poor in say, the 1930s or 40s, that welfare is generally mentioned once or twice. It was hard to get on, it barely paid you enough to eat, and social workers were always trying to get you off it. And this counted for whites as well as blacks. So we're not talking about welfare as a racial issue in the 30s or 40s. But starting in the late 60s, welfare was expanded by those Columbia social workers. Their idea was benevolent. They were trying to create a guaranteed income, but that didn't happen. And it left black communities where it was possible to spend your life, if you were a woman, living on welfare, and to spend your life making children you didn't have to take care of if you were a man. You couldn't do that in 1958 because the government wasn't going to take care of the kids. So the issue is not that black people were somehow evil to go on the welfare. If it was offered, of course, about every third person took it. That's human nature. But if that welfare hadn't existed, the black community today would be much more coherent than it was. There's no such thing as whole communities where having a father was strange until welfare was changed that way. It was one of the most important aspects of black history, what those people did to welfare legislation, although it should also be said that it was spearheaded by George Wiley, who was black. But still, it was a grievous, grievous wrong. And the people involved in that, even today, the ones who are alive, have blood on their hands, and they had a more profound effect on the black community across this country than factories moving away or anybody using the word nigger or any of the other things that we're trained to think more about.
Welfare reform, 1996.
Hallelujah.
Dramatic decline in welfare rolls, certainly in New York City and
60%.
New York
Yep.
State. What was the impact of welfare reform on on the state of black America, but really how did it impact this therapeutic alienation, if it did at all, and what are its prospects as well as its successes, and what are its failures?
Well, it's 10 years after welfare reform, and what we're seeing is that at least after 10 years, there's no magic bullet in terms of the behavior of the generation raised by women who now no longer can be on welfare for longer than 5 years, which I espouse. There should be welfare for 5 years, but it just has to have that kind of limit. What we're seeing is that people who were living as dependents for all of their lives, now are working in low-level jobs. We're often told that the problem is that they're not middle class. To be honest, maybe flinty, but honest, I'm not sure why we expected these women to be middle class just 10 years later. That's not the way things work. But they are working poor, their lives are not very glamorous, but their lives now are better than what their lives were 15 years ago. Not only do they have more money, not only do their kids have more money to be brought up with, and that's been shown in studies, but they're working for a living, and their kids are watching people work for a living.
Are the quote-unquote social pathologies that were associated with welfare, are those diminishing? In other words, are the number of female-headed families declining among blacks? I mean, or is there, again, going back to sort of the statistical evidence for the thesis, is it there? And can we expect it after 10 years? I would think you would have some senses after a decade.
The data does not work out as neatly as one might. Like, for example, what I'm supposed to say is that teen pregnancy is down. But the fact is that it started going down before welfare reform, so you can't link the two.
Right.
In general, what we are seeing is that, of course, more people are working and that their incomes are somewhat higher than before. Now, what we're not seeing is an increase in marriage. That's not as important to me as a woman being a single mother is fine, but it's just a matter of being a single mother and going to work every day and setting that kind of model for your children and creating that kind of community. I personally, despite the fact that I'm identified as this fire-breathing backwards conservative, I'm not interested in the idea of black America suddenly being these Cosby Show families. I frankly don't give a darn whether anybody's married. It's just a matter of whether you go to work every day.
Okay. Let's move to specific topics that you deal with in the book and you've dealt with in myriad articles and op-eds. Hip-hop. You don't like hip-hop. You don't like rap.
That's not true.
Well, you're the holder of the opinions. You argue that these hold blacks back.
No, I don't. Let's
Okay, go ahead. I'm misreading it.
I'm going to say
then.
this in this interview, the one time I've ever said it in public,
Go ahead.
because I know it won't be on national TV. Why Hip-Hop Holds Black Back is a title given to that piece by an overly aggressive editor who made that piece into a kind of statement that I don't really consider to represent my views.
Wow.
And I stopped writing for City Journal after that article because
Interesting.
it made me ill.
Interesting.
Unfortunately, it's the most read piece I've ever written. I do not.
As a matter of fact, that's obviously where I got it.
I don't dislike hip-hop. However, it makes me physically ill to listen to anybody, including these professors, who are telling people that hip-hop is revolutionary and that it's a political statement. I think that's a horrible distraction.
Well,
from
you
reality.
called it a thuggish adversarial stance, and
Which it
that
is.
it represented a properly authentic response to a racist society. And you point out, and you're not the first one. I mean, many of us who listen to it or have children who listen to it, some of whom are black and some of whom are white, the violence and the misogyny in the music, I shouldn't give my opinion, I found appalling. When you talk about Grandmaster Flash with the message, or Ice-T as Cop Killer, and the irony there now that he's a TV star on one of the Law and Orders is...
Because it was therapeutic alienation. He didn't mean it. That's exactly what I mean.
My point exactly. And then the misogyny of it, Jay-Z is that yo bitch. And then NWA rather, life ain't nothing but bitches and money.
Yeah, bitches.
So why do you not dislike rap and hip hop?
As far as, there are many people who are more articulate about this than I am. I don't love the misogyny, but it's in quotation marks to an extent. Okay. Now, I have said that it is the most misogynist music consistently that's ever been produced by human beings in 150,000 years. But on the other hand, to an extent, they don't mean it. You don't look at these lyrics and actually think that the person wants to do that. My main point is, if the music is full of whores being shot and people's cervixes getting hurt and all the stuff about the butts and the bitches and everything, how is it political? How can somebody, especially with a PhD, stand up and think that this music is going to move us to the next level? It's going to move us on the dance floor, and that's exactly where it belongs.
But in fact, it moves you backwards.
No.
Because doesn't it reinforce?
God damn that City Journal article. See, that is something that was put in by that editor. It doesn't move anything backwards. It doesn't move anything at all. You know?
I don't know if you're right. I think that it has a pernicious effect on black youth in general, and certain particular black youth, and not only black youth, and it prevents them from making it in the mainstream, which you want. So I disagree with your own interpretation of your own work.
Try a thought experiment. Let's say that music hadn't existed. Don't you think that the kids would be doing the same stuff? They'd walk the same way. They'd do the same.
I don't know. Without the existence of the music and the video, it may have existed, but it may, as you recognize, it began slow and then it broke out. Maybe there was Malcolm Gladwell can talk about a tipping point about this. But I think there's certainly an accelerant and an intensifying element to it, if not causal. I don't think. I just don't see how. I don't see how you can make that point.
It's a soundtrack to a way of thinking that already existed, I think. I don't think that a sexy beat and lyrics about how tough somebody is make somebody go shoot someone over their iPod.
Yeah, but the shooting and the news media and the hero making of the shooters and the shooties, that doesn't have a pernicious effect?
The larger things you're talking about, yeah. I mean, there's a reason why
but they're inextricably
Hot
intertwined.
97 is now being asked to leave. You know, why are these guys walking around shooting each other? I can't say, as I try to be a thinking person, I can't say what those MP3 tracks have to do with that. I don't know what the chicken-egg relationship is. Clearly, there's a problem with that corner of the culture.
Let's turn to another subject that you've written about and spoken about, and that's Katrina. The media and many blacks and white liberals, politicians and otherwise, that Katrina was some kind of moral lesson about white racism. And Kanye West said, quote, George Bush doesn't care about black people. Katrina obviously said something about black Americans, and you recognize this, but it's not the conventional what we learned from it. What is it? What did we learn? What ought to we learn? And how does it move us forward, what we've learned?
Yep, the Katrina lesson, well, unfortunately, nobody's going to listen to the lesson, so we're not going to move forward, which is clear from the way things are going in New Orleans now. The lesson about white racism that Katrina taught was that it was racist of supposedly benevolent white people in the late 1960s to hook so many poor black Americans on the dole, which is what happened. In New Orleans, there were roughly 25,000 families. And New Orleans isn't that big a city. 25,000 families on welfare before welfare reform. Now today, there are only about 6,000 or 7,000. And that's because welfare reform makes it harder to get on or to stay on welfare. What we saw on those cameras was people 10 years past welfare reform. And these people are still struggling to learn how to live as not dependents. New Orleans was hit so hard by welfare expansion in the late 60s. And so a lot of people think that what we're just seeing is that black people are on the bottom. That many black people wouldn't have been that far on the bottom if it weren't for what happened in big cities in the late 60s.
But you seem to purposely leave out analytically the impacts of larger forces and in order to make your central argument. Do you disagree that these other forces are synergistic with it, that this culture may be a dominant cause, but it seems, your argument seems to make it the exclusive cause. It almost sounds monocausal, and that these other elements really don't impact at all the political and the macroeconomic.
Sure. I see what you mean. A lot of people want to talk about the structural societal factors. They know that culture matters a little, but they don't want to talk about that because they think it doesn't matter very much and that it matters so little that to distract people into talking about it would be to derail the discussion from the things that really need to be changed. This is important. In the same way. I know that factories moving away is not optimal. I know that there is racism in society. Those things are about like this. Now, that's not rhetoric. There are many studies done by academics often hoping to find, for example, that the factory jobs moving away is the problem. They find again and again that that accounts for, at most, there are 4 studies I know of that show that factories moving away accounts for, at most, a third of the reason why young, uneducated black men are unemployed. And so for me, that's too little to matter. It's the culture we have to talk about.
Come on.
And then there are 2 others for each one. Yeah, it's a third. And it makes intuitive sense.
But that's a lot.
But what about the other two?
No, I understand that, but to ignore a third of the variance.
Oh, not
in
to ignore,
behavior.
but why pay more attention to that? if it's
Okay,
just a third?
okay, so it's a question of reframing and refocusing, in a sense, what you're doing.
Refocusing for a reason,
Right.
which is that we're refocusing on things that, one, can be changed.
Okay.
Bring the factories back.
Good.
And that have more effect.
Okay, sort of the last large question. Who is this book for? Who are the audience? What do you expect to come out of this, or what would you like to see to come out of this?
I want people to understand that culture matters. That book is written, in my mind, for this blob of a person who's of any color, who probably reads at least one news magazine a week and probably has a BA. I can't help writing on that
Okay.
level. And the idea is to make people realize that you can talk about culture and still have a heart and still be informed. My book is not about condemning black culture. I think you can read it carefully and see. I withdraw from that. I don't hate the baggy pants kid. I don't scorn the welfare mother. I understand all those people, I think. But the issue still is that, unfortunately, we are having to change something about the people, not about the way society works. And we can do that with the hope of really making a better society. But the book is for everybody. And I hope in that book, which is too long, in a way I had to pack too many facts in, I want people to realize that you can say the things I'm saying and have done some work. And that doesn't mean that my word is God's, but there's a different way of looking at these things than the standard Atlantic Monthly, NPR View, God bless both of those venues, which I subscribe to. There's another way, and we have to realize that that other way is important if we're going to get beyond the crisis in Black
And
America.
as always, Yahweh, all day, every day. Peace.